Hello everyone, I'm Anthea Lang. I'm a local history author and tour guide, and I like nothing better than a good walk around an interesting cemetery. This is the second part of a talk which aired last week. This week, I'm concentrating on Gateshead East Cemetery, looking at its history, taking a look at some of its gravestones, and telling you about some of the people who are buried here. Gateshead East opened in August 1862. It was built following various acts of Parliament which banned town centre burials in the 1850s. Gateshead Council borrowed £11,000 from the government, which was payable by 30 annual instalments at 5% interest. The land it is built on was originally owned by the then rector, John Davies, who agreed to sell 20 acres at £250 an acre. The cemetery was constructed to plans by John Lamb, who was paid £200. What you can see here is one of two raised beds which were built as part of the cemetery design, one in the consecrated section, the other in the non-consecrated section. The first burial in the cemetery was of Margaret Milburn, an 18-year-old girl, on the 13th of August 1862. The next 6 burials that took place were all of babies or children under 5, and all are in unmarked graves. To date, approximately 117,000 people have been buried in this cemetery. I showed this plan last week, but in case you haven't yet watched part 1 or need a recap, I thought it was worth having another look at it. The purple outlined square is St Edmund's Churchyard, and next to it, outlined in pink, is the consecrated section of Gateshead East. This is for Church of England burials only. The green section is unconsecrated and is used for burials of all other denominations. Here we can see at the left the Nonconformist Chapel, which opened in 1862. At first, it was thought it wasn't necessary to have a Church of England chapel, as there was a perfectly good church, St Edmund's, very nearby. However, the rector at the time felt that so many funerals were interfering with his church services that he insisted on a designated Church of England chapel, and this one on the right opened in 1869. The cemetery superintendent's house was occupied from March 1862 by the first cemetery superintendent, John OShea, and this later had greenhouses added. We'll hear a bit more about John OShea shortly. The opening of Gateshead East in 1862 coincided with the rise in popularity of ornate and heavily carved gravestones. The Victorians loved nothing better than a good funeral, and often more money was spent on commemorating the dead than the dead had ever experienced in life. There were any number of stone carvers locally, and most gravestones will bear the sculptor's name. Popular in this cemetery are Beales at Newcastle, and Currie, Shilling and Wilson, all of Gateshead. Now personally, I love angels on gravestones, and this is one of my favourites. These two slightly snooty looking angels, who look like they're swinging from a rope, adorn the grave of Thomas Shanks, a Newcastle cabman, who is mentioned in Jordy Ridley's song of the same name. Angels are a very popular feature on gravestones, and it's quite common to see a carving of a weeping angel. Under this one are 2 particularly well carved doves. Like angels, they are often featured on headstones. There are a number of different designs of doves in the cemetery. Of course, many of these would come as they do today from catalogues, but the quality of the carving can vary enormously. This grave is interesting on 2 counts. Firstly, because of its design. I have never seen another Salvation Army headstone anywhere, although I'm sure there must be some. Secondly, David Bevan and both of his wives are buried here. The stone carver got the name of David's second wife slightly wrong. Here she is named as Helen, but in actual fact, Helen was an Ellen. David and Ellen died within 2 weeks of each other. I'm pretty sure this design didn't come out of a catalogue. This finely executed gravestone with a lovely depiction of various tools commemorates a Gateshead builder, William Smith, and it also has lovely carvings down each side. And this one is, to me, one of the most original and slightly mad gravestones that I have ever seen. The carving is beautifully done and stands really proud from the back of the headstone. It's done by a sculptor called Robert Currie, who I don't know anything about, but he seemed to like carving palm trees, as there is another of his on a nearby gravestone. This would be very expensive to construct, and I've never seen another one like it. If you're wondering what James Coupe did for a living, he was a publican. And now let's have a look at some of the people who are buried here. I've chosen this grave, not for its design or even particularly for anyone who's buried here, but because of the term relict used on it. Often seen on older gravestones, this is an archaic term used for a widow. This is an unusual gravestone to the memory of Charles Bertram, who isn't actually here. He was blown up in an explosion in the Great Fire of Gateshead in Newcastle in 1854, and it says on the gravestone, his remains could not be recognised. What was left of him was only identified by a snuff box bearing his initials and a house key. This grave commemorates Joseph Willis Swinburne, Gateshead's third town clerk. He was succeeded by his son William, who we'll see buried in the nonconformist section of the cemetery. Together, they had an unbroken run of being town clerk from 1856 until 1929. And this is the largest memorial in the cemetery, and deservedly so. This commemorates William Henry Brockett. You may remember from last time, he had planned to be buried in St Edmund's Cemetery, and there's actually a little gravestone which says so. Brockett was very largely responsible for Gateshead being allocated an MP for the first time under the Great Reform Act of 1832. He also founded the Gateshead Observer and was Mayor of Gateshead in 1839. A part of the ground where Brockett was buried was given free by the council, and the memorial was paid for by public subscription. John Usher, the first cemetery superintendent, is buried in an unmarked grave just to the rear of Brockett's memorial. It's rather sad he doesn't have a gravestone, as he held a number of important posts in Gateshead during his lifetime. Chief of the Watch Committee, First Master of the Union Workhouse, and First Superintendent of Births, Marriages and Deaths. He was frequently accused of malpractice, employing extra grave diggers, thus increasing the cost of burials, and buying plants for the cemetery out of council funds. However, none of these accusations were ever proved. I always like looking for occupations on headstones, and here Thomas Anderson is described as a bone setter, the early version of an orthopaedic surgeon. In an advert, it was said that he has made the art of bone setting his special study. In every case where a cure is possible, a cure will be made. William Lindley Leach has quite a history. He joined Gateshead Police in 1846, and the following year was discovered drunk on duty and reprimanded. In 1849, he was accused of using excessive force against a prisoner. In 1851, he was found loitering in the George and Dragon pub for 20 minutes after licensing hours had ended. In 1852, he was fined a shilling for loitering in a public house on Bridge Street. And the next year was found loitering with the railway gatekeeper in Oakwellgate, having left his beat between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. In 1861, he was found drunk on duty and reprimanded. Finally, in 1866, he was pensioned off due to frequent dislocation of the shoulder. It must have been all that drinking. Oswald March and Robert Simpkins lie in adjacent graves. Oswald was an engine driver, whilst Robert was a railway inspector. The inscription on Simpkins' grave reads, This monument is erected by his friends in tribute to his work, candour, and earnestness of life. He was upwards of 40 years in the employment of the NER. Very often railwaymen were members of burial clubs, so often have rather grander gravestones than you might expect. This is a modern grave, and you'll see why shortly. James Renforth could be regarded as the best drawer in the world in Victorian times, but his life was cut tragically short after heart failure, probably due to an epileptic fit. It caused his death at the early age of 29 during a rowing race in Canada in 1871. Renforth's body was embalmed and packed in a triple coffin and external packing case, so it could be returned to Tyneside and taken to Renforth's house in James Street. When the house was reached, the coffin was taken out of its case, and his widow was able to see Renforth's face through a plate glass window set into the coffin lid. And this is where this remarkable memorial is today, outside the Shipley Art Gallery. This depicts the dying spirit of Renforth in the arms of Harry Kelly, the Thames oarsman who was one of the crew in Renforth's boat. The statue is by George Burns, who did other sculptures to oarsmen, Harry Clasper at Wickham and Robert Chambers in Walker Cemetery. Now this path divides the conformist cemetery from the non-conformist section, which is behind the stone pillars. People sometimes mistakenly think this path divides Gateshead East from St Edmunds, but it doesn't. It's appropriate that Benjamin Biggar is buried here, as he opened the cemetery when he was Mayor of Gateshead in 1862. His funeral was a grand affair, attended by many people who were subsequently buried here. Only the base of the gravestone remains today, but obviously something much more impressive originally stood on top of it. Here are two identical graves with the same wording at the top of each: the burial grave of Lancelot Julep Penman. Only one of these can be correct. Penman had a grand sense of his importance. His wife memorably described herself in the 1891 census as, in the fullest sense, a general servant. A butcher, he became a town councillor in 1877, became mayor 3 times, and in 37 years of service on the council, attended over 10,000 meetings. That's approximately 200 a year. The grave at the right is older than the other. Penman erected it when his brother died as a result of a boating accident on the Tyne near Hexham, and then buried so many other family members in the plot that he was compelled to erect an identical gravestone next to it, in which both he and his wife are buried. George Davidson started out life as a builder and then a butcher before learning the glass trade and setting up a glass factory in the Thames area of Gateshead. Here the firm produced pressed glass, sometimes described as the poor man's cut glass. At one time, virtually every household in Gateshead would have a piece of Davidson glass. But how did he get into glass in the first place? Well, the story goes that his wife came home one day complaining she was unable to buy a glass chimney for an oil lamp. George, inspired by Sowerby's, the main glass firm in Gateshead, decided to learn glassmaking. He started with glass chimneys with great success. He was well liked and had a kindliness of disposition and a charitable character. He was a man of enormous energy and involved himself in many local businesses and societies, becoming a JP and later alderman and mayor of Gateshead. He died suddenly while on his way to church from his residence at Dunstan Hill in 1891. Andrew Shillinglaw was a monumental mason, and both of his sons later became stonemasons. There are a number of Shillinglaw graves in this cemetery. Nearly all are pink granite like this one, and all have the firm's name inscribed. Joseph Willis Swinburne's gravestone that we saw earlier was by Shillinglaw. William Swinburne was described as a man of few words, but many kindly and shrewd actions. He took over as town clerk after his father, Joseph Willis Swinburne, died in 1893, and he had the responsibility of welcoming King George V and Queen Mary to the Shipley Gallery reception, which followed the opening of the Tyne Bridge. As a record was made of the speeches that day, William is probably perhaps the only person in Gateshead East of whom we have a recording of his voice. He was a keen sportsman and early cyclist, as well as being a proficient musician. He could play the flute, bassoon, and cello. He enjoyed holidaying in the Hebrides and learned to speak Gaelic. He was also described as the best type of British cultured professional man. Will Currie was a professional boxer who was active between 1893 and 1917. He boxed at flyweight, bantamweight, featherweight, and took part in 23 professional contests. After he retired from boxing, he ran the Phoenix pub on Gateshead High Street, which is now better known as Currie's. His real name was actually William Cawley, but the Americans couldn't understand his strong Irish accent, and he became William Currie. Joseph Skipsey was certainly a character. He started working in the mines as a 7-year-old, and when he was 20, walked most of the way to London, worked on the railways there, and married his landlady. Returning to the northeast for the next 7 years, he worked in Sunderland collieries and produced his first book of poetry in 1859. For a brief period, he was a librarian at the Lytton Phil, and then worked as custodian of Shakespeare's birthplace in Stratford-upon-Avon. He gave that post up as he was not convinced of the provenance of some of the artefacts. He and his wife returned to the northeast to live, and he died at his son's house in Lowfell. The verse on his gravestone is from one of his poems. We're now back in the consecrated section of the cemetery, where we find someone who most people in the northeast will have heard of, Jordy Ridley, author of the Jordy anthem, The Bladen Races. This is a modern grave, as Jordy was originally buried without a headstone. He started life as a miner, but a severe accident put paid to that employment, and he became a popular performer, performing topical songs in Geordie dialect. Nearby is the headstone to his brother Stephen, who was a popular runner. Finally, at the entrance to the cemetery on Wordsworth Street, you will find this cross of sacrifice. There are a large number of graves in Gateshead East, and this cross commemorates not only the servicemen buried here, but also those buried in Saltwell Cemetery. It was unveiled on the 11th of April 1924. So we've now reached the end of our tour, which I hope you've enjoyed. I hope it inspires you to take a look around your local cemetery. You will discover some amazing stories if you do.